Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are out there in the world, welcome to the High Wire. Many of you are brand new joining us for the first time on the High Wire. You've heard about the reporting that is taking place only here. This is nothing like mainstream media. Today's show, virtually every piece of scientific evidence in it is going to fly in the face of the paradigm being described to us by the United States government, many of the government agencies around the world, and scientists that are at the top of health agencies around the world. This makes this broadcast, I think, difficult and somewhat dangerous in a climate where we're beginning to censor people who have a difference of opinion. But here's what we now know. There is no longer scientific consensus across the world when it comes to COVID-19. There is now a divide that is growing every day between scientists, between virologists, between MDs, between mathematicians, on whether or not we are correct on COVID-19, whether or not we were right on the numbers, and whether or not we've been treating it correctly. I'm going to be meeting with one of those top world-renowned mathematicians later in the show. Knut Witkowski is going to be talking to me about the math as someone who understands how we should be looking at the models. He thinks we've made a tragic mistake in how we've dealt with COVID-19. I'm also going to be talking to Mike Cernovich, who is an author. He's a journalist, and he is a filmmaker who has been really digging deep into how we are manipulated by the press and how incorrect the press can be and how it moves to bring us mistruths. He's breaking a story today that you will see here on the High Wire. But first, I'm going to go a little bit out of order. Usually, we like to start the show out with looking at all the things that happened in the last week. But I think there's a more pressing discussion. Earlier this week, there was an MD from New York that came out, put out a video that has gone viral around the world, pleading with all the other MDs, nurses, and doctors and scientists around the world, saying it looks like we may be doing more damage. We may be killing people with COVID-19. He said he didn't have the answers, but he was looking for the international community to step outside of the box, outside of the paradigm, and try and find a better way forward. This is what that video sounded like.
This is Dr. Cameron Kyle Seidel, ER and critical care doctor from New York City. 9 days ago, I opened an intensive care unit to care for the sickest COVID-positive patients in this city. In these 9 days, I have seen things I have never seen before. In treating these patients, I have witnessed medical phenomena that just don't make sense in the context of treating a disease that is supposed to be a viral pneumonia. 9 days ago, I presumed I was opening an intensive care unit to treat patients with a virus causing a pneumonia that was ravaging lungs across the world, starting out as something mild, a cough, a sore throat, and progressively increasing in severity until ultimately ending in something called acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. This is the paradigm that every hospital in the country is working under. And yet, everything I've seen in the last 9 days, all the things that just don't make sense, the patients I'm seeing in front of me, the lungs I'm trying to improve, have led me to believe that COVID-19 is not this disease, and that we are operating under a medical paradigm that is untrue. In short, I believe we are treating the wrong disease, and I fear that this misguided treatment will lead to a tremendous amount of harm to a great number of people in a very short time. As New York City appears to be about 10 days ahead of the country, I feel compelled to get this information out. COVID-19 lung disease, as far as I can see, is not a pneumonia and should not be treated as one. Rather, it appears as some kind of viral-induced disease, most resembling high-altitude sickness. It is as if tens of thousands of my fellow New Yorkers are on a plane at 30,000 feet and the cabin pressure is slowly being let out. These patients are slowly being starved of oxygen. I have seen patients dependent on oxygen take off their oxygen and quickly progress through a state of anxiety and emotional distress and eventually get blue in the face. And while they look like patients absolutely on the brink of death, they do not look like patients dying of pneumonia. I have never been a mountain climber, and I do not know the conditions at base camp below the highest peaks in the world. But I suspect that the patients I'm seeing in front of me look most like as if a person was dropped off on the top of Mount Everest without time to acclimate. I don't know the final answer of this disease, but I'm quite sure that a ventilator is not it.
That was Dr. Cameron Kyle Seidel, literally almost apparently shouting from the rooftops. When I watched this video, I had some concerns because we had been getting inside reports from doctors saying things like everybody on a respirator dies from COVID-19, something that I had never heard before. And maybe had we not been getting reports like that, I might not have taken this video by Dr. Kyle Seidel so seriously. But there was something chilling about it, something honest about it. And it made me wonder, are we going to look back in history as this being a Paul Revere moment, a doctor, someone stepping out from inside the system saying, I think we're making a tragic mistake? He was later interviewed just a few days later by WebMD. Here is some of what he had to say when he was asked questions getting deeper into this conversation.
You say you see things that you've never seen before. What are some of those things that you're seeing?
When I initially started treating patients, I was under the impression, as most people were, that I was going to be treating acute respiratory distress syndrome that was similar in some sense to the ARDS that I saw as a fellow. And as I started to treat these patients, I witnessed things that are just unusual. And I'm sure doctors around the country are experiencing this. In the past, we don't see patients that are talking in full sentences and not complaining of overt shortness of breath with saturations in the high 70s. It's just not something we typically see. I've seen literally a saturation of 0 on a monitor, which is not something we ever want and something we actually actively try to avoid. The patients in front of me are unlike any patients I've ever seen. When we had a patient who had hit what we called our trigger to put in a breathing tube, meaning she had displayed a level of hypoxemia, of low oxygen levels, where we thought she would need a breathing tube. And most of the times when patients hit that level of hypoxemia, they are in distress and they can barely talk and they can't say complete sentences. And she could do all of those, and she did not want a breathing tube. And so she asked that we put it in at the last minute possible. And it was this perplexing clinical condition. When I was supposed to put the breathing tube in, when was the last minute possible? And all the instincts as a physician, we're looking to see if she, so-called tires out, if she's getting too tired. None of those things occurred. I came to realize that this condition is nothing I've ever seen before. And so I started to try to read. I sort of came upon decompression pulmonary sickness, which is, essentially the bends when divers dive and come up too quick, which seemed to have some kind of a mirror picture clinically as these patients. And then, in discussions with other people, it came up that, they do similarly appear clinically. And this is not to say that the pathophysiology underlying it is similar, but clinically they look a lot more like high altitude sickness than do pneumonia. And Gattinoni, he published something on March 20th. By the time I read what he was saying, I'd come under the impression that this just wasn't the usual ARDS that we were used to seeing. He's suggesting that the management strategy that we use is essentially somewhat flipped, at least in these high compliant patients. We may be not operating under the right paradigm, which is
how have you changed your protocols then?
So to be honest, I've run into a great deal of resistance within my institution. These are the protocols that are in every major hospital and minor hospital. I mean, we generally
you talked about in your videos,
yeah,
against long-standing dogma. So what's been the response from your clinical colleagues as well as hospital administrators?
So to be honest, in the ICU, I started to try to run not my own protocols, but to treat patients as I would have treated my family under with a different goals, which is to say a ventilation. However, these didn't fit the protocol. And the protocol is what the hospital runs on, what the respiratory therapists, what the nurses. I mean, everyone is part of the team. And so actually we ran into an impasse where I could not morally in a patient-doctor relationship, I could not continue the current protocols, which again are the protocols at the top hospitals in the country. But I could not continue those. And obviously they couldn't have someone, you can't have one doctor just doing their own protocol. So I actually had to step down from my position in the ICU. And so now I'm back in the ER. As far as how we're going to switch is we're going to take our approach differently from the traditional ARDSNet protocol, in that we are going to do an oxygen first strategy.
I want to give a shout out and thank WebMD for that very thorough interview. You can go to WebMD to see the entire thing. Of course, we have just cut that down to bring the basic information to you. But I just want to go through, if you were watching it or you happen to see that this week, there are many things that were so chilling about this idea. Now remember, this is just one doctor. He has a theory. He's describing what he's looking at and saying he believes other doctors are seeing the same thing. Now remember, we are being told all around the world that for most people, coronavirus does not affect, and over 99% of us are going to have maybe no symptoms at all, or perhaps it's going to be like a common cold. But for this very tiny group of people, they're having an extreme acute reaction that is demanding the use of respirators. In fact, we've been even told that perhaps we're not locking down in quarantine because there's a risk to a larger death rate, but we simply don't want to see the hospitals overrun because they lack enough respirators, which could lead to an increase in the death rate, which might make some sense. But now the question that is being posed here by Dr. Cameron Kyle Seidel is, what if this death rate shouldn't have been as high as it is because we were killing these patients with the incorrect protocol? At least that's what I'm reading into as he's describing it. And he talks about an anecdotal experience inside of, where he was working in the ICU, where he said there's like nothing I've ever seen. A patient, normally when we were going to intubate them, remember, we're going to put them in a coma. We're going to give them drugs to take away their immediate consciousness, and then put a hose, a tube, a ventilator down into their throat. And what he's saying is, normally when you're doing that, every other time when I'm dealing with, this type of crisis, the patient isn't talking to you. They're out of sorts. They're in a desperate situation. Yet in this situation, I have a woman fully coherent, talking to me, saying, I really don't want to do that. I don't want you to intubate me until the very last minute. And he said, so then I'm asking myself the question, well, when would the last minute be if you're fully conscious? I've never been here before. And it just really made me, as we start looking at these death numbers and thinking about this idea, all of these patients, how common was this? How many people around the world were stepping into ERs and talking to the doctor, fully alert and experiencing something different, and then were taken and put on a respirator, on a ventilator, never to be heard from again? I mean, that really is chilling. Normally, a doctor must feel very good. We're losing the patient. They're not able to communicate with us. So you go into these extraordinary measures. Are we to understand that perhaps many of these patients around the world have been fully coherent and allowing doctors to then put them in a coma and onto a respirator? It's really, really a chilling thought, especially if they got it wrong. Now, in order to get a better understanding of this, I want to bring in someone that is well-trained in emergency medicine. Dr. James Neuenschwander is joining us now. Dr. Neuenschwander, the first question I have, and first of all, thank you for joining me, is I think for most of us, what he describes at the end of this video is that he's moving into a different protocol to use oxygen first. My understanding was a ventilator is oxygen. So for those out there that are maybe missing the significance or the detail or the difference between them, what is the difference between giving oxygen and using a ventilator? Can you take me through that process?
Sure, Del. So you can deliver oxygen in a number of different ways. A ventilator is just one way to deliver oxygen. And the difference between a ventilator and just having a nasal cannula or a face mask is that this is still using your own respiration. You're breathing the air in, you're creating a negative pressure, you're sucking the air into your lung. When you use a ventilator, you're pushing air into the lung, and that creates a completely different dynamic. The other thing is, once you paralyze a person, now you're completely depending on that ventilator to do all the breathing for them, and it's very much dependent on how you set up that ventilator, and that's what he was talking about in terms of maybe we're setting this up the wrong way.
Very interesting. You know, and I want to point this out. He is no longer all alone. I mean, this was just a few days ago. It was the first that I've heard of it, but now we are seeing a report. This was just in the Chicago Tribune yesterday. Let me read this. Some doctors are moving away from ventilators to treat coronavirus patients. The reason? Unusually high death rates. It goes on to say, as health officials around the world push to get more ventilators to treat coronavirus patients, some doctors are moving away from using the breathing machines when they can. The reason? Some hospitals reported unusually high death rates for coronavirus patients on ventilators, and some doctors worry that the machines could be harming certain patients. Generally speaking, 40 to 50% of patients with severe respiratory distress die while on ventilators, experts say, but 80% or more of coronavirus patients placed on the machines in New York City have died, state and city officials say. Now, why would they be dying? I mean, so first of all, what damage can be done by a ventilator that's not done by oxygen? What are they talking about? What are the risks that, you know, all of them? What drugs are being used? What is the process of putting someone on a ventilator?
Well, typically, you're going to give somebody some type of sedation. You don't really want them awake. You're going to paralyze them, and that's one of the biggest reasons to give sedation. But you're going to paralyze them, and then you're going to put the tube down their throat, and you're going to put them on the ventilator. Now, once you're on a ventilator, you usually have to have pretty heavy sedation. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting this thing. So once that tube is down and you're putting that pressure in, the idea is you're trying to minimize the pressure you're using to get the job done. Because the higher the pressure is, the more likely you are to damage those lungs. I mean, the lungs are kind of delicate tissue, and you don't want to get too much pressure. Now, what they're talking about and what he is talking about is different treatment protocols. They're treating this early COVID when they're being put on ventilators as though it is like ARDS, which is sort of an end stage of a typical pneumonia kind of infection. And what they're saying in these studies is it doesn't look like that's what we're seeing on CAT scans or what you're seeing on physical exam. So the pressure that they're using can damage the lungs, and that may actually make the situation worse rather than better.
Is there, you know, so when we reached out to you to start looking into this, you know, of course, this is brand new. This doctor could be wrong. I want to make that, this is brand new, a breaking story. But for those of you that are following the High Wire for the first time, we investigate with you. We are not going to come to the answers, then just bring you the answers. I am talking to Dr. Neuenschwander really for the first time. We like to have the investigation out in front of you. We have an MD in New York that's demanding that the international body of scientists come together and try and help with this issue. Now, when you heard the things that he was saying, that I don't believe this is a pneumonia, I don't see fluid in the lungs, that there appears to be much more flexibility to these lungs, that they don't have difficulty moving their lungs, which is why you would use a ventilator. They seem to be starved of oxygen. What were your thoughts on that, and where did you look to try and see, is this a different type of illness?
Yeah, well, it turns out that one of the doctors that was involved in northern Italy, in the outbreak in northern Italy, Dr. Gattinoni, actually published an editorial piece in one of the journals, and he showed differences in the CAT scans between these patients. So when you typically look at a CAT scan from a patient that has classic ARDS, which is what all these protocols are for, their lungs have fluid in them. They're whited out. There's a lot of heaviness to the lungs. But you look at the CAT scan of patients that are in the earlier stages of COVID where they're short of breath and they don't have very good oxygen saturations, and their lungs don't look that bad. They're dark on the CAT scan. There's plenty of oxygen. The entire lung looks like it has air in it, and it's not all collapsed and full of fluid. So he actually published that probably a week ago. It's just, you know, it takes time for this stuff to come to light, and there are just paper after paper after paper every day trying to figure this out. So you have to go back to, all right, we are assuming that the problem is with the lungs. The lungs are not exchanging gas the way they're supposed to. And that's where you start using a ventilator. And remember, we are trained as doctors, when in doubt, intubate. Intubation is the safest thing you can do. Now you have control of the airway, you have control of the lung, you have control of the oxygen. So we have to fight against that training in this situation. And we have to be willing to put up with a patient that has lousy oxygenation. So what he was saying was, if it's not the lungs, what is it? And
in fact, and I know that we just saw, you forwarded this to us, this study out of China. Can we see this headline really quick? I believe this is still under peer review, but obviously in China now, a study come out. COVID-19 attacks the 1-beta chain of hemoglobin and captures the porphyrin to inhibit human heme metabolism. It goes on to say this, that can we bring up the next slide? Okay. At the same time, ORFLAB, a lot of this I'm going to have you explain. ORF10, ORF3, F3A proteins could coordinate attack the heme on the 1-beta chain of hemoglobin to disassociate the iron to form the porphyrin. The attack will cause less and less hemoglobin that can carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. The lung cells have extremely intense poisoning and inflammatory due to the inability to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen frequently, which eventually results in ground-like lung glass in lung images. I mean, it sounds like, if it just from my perspective, and perhaps you can give me a better understanding, that this may not exactly be a respiratory issue or a respiratory disease, but something more like a blood disease. Am I getting that correct?
Right. So the whole idea behind the heart, the lungs, and the circulation is to deliver oxygen to tissue. Tissue needs oxygen to work. That's what we use for our respiration. Without oxygen, eventually the tissue is going to die. So that is the whole function of this system. Now, we're looking at the lungs because we're assuming this is a viral pneumonia. That would make a lot of sense. But what we're saying here is that that particular paper now gets a little bit complicated, but inside the blood, you have something called hemoglobin. This is inside your red blood cells. And the vast majority of all the oxygen in the blood is carried by hemoglobin. It's not just dissolved in the blood, it's carried by hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is made up of these heme particles. There's 4 of them. And what they're saying in this paper is that the viral glycoproteins actually displace the iron out of this heme protein. Iron is the critical ingredient. If you don't have iron, you cannot carry oxygen in the hemoglobin. So it displaces the iron. That creates a lot of free iron, and that can cause problems. But it also creates hemoglobin that no longer is hemoglobin. It can no longer carry oxygen. And what's interesting is you have something kind of like this that happens in malaria, and this is one of the targets of Plaquenil. You know, Plaquenil or chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, they will actually displace the malaria drug, the malaria protozoan off of the hemoglobin so that it maintains its structure. That is one of the theories as to why the Plaquenil helps here. It keeps the heme intact in that hemoglobin so it can carry the oxygen, because without it, your oxygen is going to plummet. So,
now,
you know, again,
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say there are many other theories, but we do know that the ferritin, so when you release free iron, iron is a very dangerous thing to be free in the body. It creates a ton of inflammation. So when you release this free iron, the body has something called ferritin that it uses to bind up that iron so it's not dangerous. And we know one of the things that people are seeing, and I just have to say, look, I've been out of the ER for a couple of years. I'm not a frontline caretaker in the ER anymore. But we know that ferritin is a marker for that free iron. It'll bind up that iron. We know the ferritin levels are very high in these patients. So that makes sense. What they're seeing clinically on the front lines makes sense with what they're talking about with this theory, with this Chinese paper.
So now what we hear from, you know, Dr. Cameron Kyle Seidel, he says, look, I had to leave the ICU. And by the way, you know, when I worked on the doctor's television show, I got to spend a lot of time in ORs and scrubbing in behind the scenes. And I've seen moments where doctors have, you know, a serious disagreement, even over a surgery table, and sometimes that can get very heated. I'm going to guess that whatever was happening in this ICU, where clearly Cameron Seidel is having an issue with how he's treating patients, and he said, I had to leave that ICU, that was probably Probably not the softest, kindest moment that ever took place in ICU. He's now down, gone down to the ER. But he's saying now we're doing something different. We're treating patients with oxygen up front, which brings a huge question for me. If this was a respiratory issue, even if it was a respiratory issue, are you telling me patients around the world have been coming in and not receiving oxygen? If that's the case, why wouldn't they be getting oxygen? Why wouldn't that have been the first step, which he's now saying he's using in the ER?
Okay, so back to how we're trained. All right, one, why do you intubate somebody? Well, you intubate somebody to protect their airway, or if they've got a lot of facial trauma or something like that. But one of the biggest reasons is because they are not oxygenating their blood. So we use something called a pulse oximeter. It just measures the percentage of the blood that's saturated. And when that pulse ox drops below a certain number, whatever that number might be, then you consider intubation. So you're talking about patients where the pulse oximetry should be over 90% normally. You're going to get nervous when it drops below 90%. But some of these patients, they're talking about pulse oxes below 70%. So of course, your training is going to say, we need to intubate these people. Your protocol is going to say we need to intubate these people. So it's not a matter of oxygen, because I'm sure all of these people are on oxygen. If you have low pulse ox, the first thing you do is you throw them on oxygen. If that doesn't work, then you try other methods, and if those don't work, you intubate. That is the whole protocol. So it's really a matter of what he's talking about is using a protocol of other ways to deliver high flow oxygen and do everything you can before you intubate somebody. And then if you do intubate somebody, you don't use the ARDS protocol, which is low volume and high ventilation. You use the opposite. You use a higher volume and a lower ventilation, and you don't use these high pressures that you need in ARDS, because you just don't need it. You're just going to cause damage if you do that.
So when you talk about other forms of delivering oxygen, I'm still curious. Before we get to this ventilator, he's doing something different. So what are the other forms of oxygen that can be delivered that he's now moving into?
Right. So none of these are optimum. So one, the simplest would simply be to have a nasal cannula and then a 100% face mask over the top of that. The second is what you're showing here, which is a high flow nasal cannula. Now you can actually deliver quite a bit of oxygen this way. The machine can deliver up to 50 to 60 liters per minute of oxygen. So that is a lot. The trouble with any of those, once you increase the flow, then you have the problem of, are you spewing virus into the air? Okay. And then a step up from that nasal cannula is to actually put on a tight-fitting mask and use some type of positive pressure. So either CPAP, which anybody who has sleep apnea is familiar with that, or BiPAP, which is kind of a modification of CPAP. But again, that keeps you off the ventilator. But those are getting into that positive pressure. You're blowing air into the lungs now, and you're also aerosolizing all this virus, and that makes it a risk for other people. So
is that perhaps why, right there, what you just said, aerosolizing the virus, do you think that's partially why we weren't moving in that direction around the world? Is a concern that we were going to aerosolize it all over the hospital?
I believe so. I believe that was a big concern for using CPAP and BiPAP type masks. They're lifesavers in the ER. You have somebody come in an acute respiratory distress from asthma or something like that. You're ready to intubate them. You put them on a BiPAP. An hour later, they're breathing comfortably. So they are a huge, huge benefit. But again, they're a mess. They're going to be blowing everything all over the room. And if that patient has a virus, then you're going to aerosolize the virus. And even with high flow nasal cannula, that can happen. I mean, it's not as bad. So a lot of people are saying, let's put on high flow nasal cannula and then put a mask over that, because that is preferable to intubating somebody. Again, the take-home message that he was trying to deliver, and he's not alone. I mean, there are more doctors that are getting on this train because they are seeing that what they are doing is not working. A good doctor is going to look at a patient and say, we tried the protocol, it didn't work. Why? What else could be going on? Do we have all these microclots so the blood isn't flowing to the lung? Do we have a problem with the hemoglobin? Do we have some other type of respiratory problem that we're not thinking of? Why isn't this working? And then walk back from that and figure out a solution to it. So there are a lot of people out there that are a heck of a lot smarter than I am that are figuring these things out because they're on the front lines and they're seeing what does not work.
Yeah, but
don't.
come on. I mean, they're seeing it, but come on, we're like months late here, Dr. New. I mean, when we think about it, what took so long? You have to imagine that in China, they were already seeing this issue. They must have had patients just like this MD in New York is describing, Cameron's describing, where they're talking to you. They're not like any other patient you've ever seen. They're doing chest x-rays. What takes so long? I mean, this is where I think we trust our doctors. We trust that they're these critical thinking people, and we got a brand new illness that is sweeping the world. Aren't they all sitting at a table together going, hey, I'm calling you, you're calling me, we're talking to CDC, there's something different here? Why are we only finding out right now because one doctor was bold enough to get on a camera, risk his career, and speak to the world? What is wrong with medicine that is taking so long?
Yeah, medicine has really become a set of protocols, and it's almost like the doctor is being taken out of the equation. We really should be able to evaluate our patients and determine what's best for our patients. Now, in defense of all of that, there's something called best practices. The idea behind best practices is, hey, we went through all this research, we came up with a protocol. This is the best way to treat people that have this particular problem. And the reason why they do that is they don't want a doctor who's 30, 40 years out of medical school, like me, who hasn't necessarily read anything, not like me, but who is using the same thing they did 30 or 40 years ago. They want to have the best practices for these patients. You end up with these protocols, and the trouble is these protocols become dogma. Now, if you notice the difference between those two interviews with Dr. Kyle Seidel, the first one, he's in his scrubs. I guarantee he just got off of his shift, and he just got into a pissing match with some intensivist because they wanted to do something that he knew was going to kill the patient or was going to make the patient worse, right? And so you have all that emotion. He uses the word dogma in that video, right? He doesn't use it when he's talking to the guy from Medscape, right? He tones it way down because it is dogmatic. We are stuck with these protocols. And I'm telling you, I'm sure it's still the same way. But when I used to work, if you admitted somebody with whatever, pneumonia, you had pre-printed orders. All you had to do was sign off on them. You didn't even write the orders. They were already written by a protocol. So that's where the system has gone. So that works great if you actually have ARDS. If you have something new, it doesn't work. Everything falls apart. And we have to remember, as physicians, we have to think critically. And that's where, and again, it sounds like Dr. Kyle Seidel is an emergency room doctor. You have to think critically as an emergency room doctor, because if you don't, people die, right? If what you're doing doesn't work, you have to change directions. You have to figure out what you're doing wrong and figure out a way to fix that.
Some sense that that's actually finally happening is, I think we've all been tracking Boris Johnson, who went into an ICU recently. They were saying so that a ventilator would be available to him because he apparently is moving into that critical space. And then we saw this headline, I think it was just 2 or 3 days ago, where it is clear Boris Johnson moved to ICU and given oxygen after coronavirus symptoms get worse. So obviously they're moving away from being afraid of aerosolizing the virus for arguably, I think, the most important person, the highest ranking person in the world that we've now seen get this issue. Apparently it's breaking now. I'm just being told that Boris is out of ICU. First of all, I think, thank God that he is well. I think we've all been watching him. Really interesting that as we're having this discussion, they didn't put him on a ventilator, which seemed to be the protocol around the world. They went with oxygen. Clearly, I think, it seems, and when you and I started discussing this just 2 days ago, it was, we were thinking, is this even a story worth covering? How dangerous is it? And now I think there's even statements coming from different doctors around the world. I think you shared a statement, right? Is there a new statement that there's another doctor saying he believes we may be doing more damage oh, here it is. Yep. You want to read this to me? What does this say, Dr. New?
Yeah, so this is actually great for people if they want to go online and look it up. This is EVMS Medical Group. This is East Virginia Medical School, and it's Dr. Paul Merrick. So he's been putting updates online, and it's not just for doctors and nurses, there's actually preventative mechanisms in there. Things that, I've been telling my patients to do, the various supplements to keep people out of hospitals, and then also just different levels. This, at level 1, this is what you do, level 2, this is what you do. But he's talking about all the things that we just mentioned here. So, and he is a director of, I think, their intensive care services. I might be misquoting, but he's involved with the East Virginia Medical School.
Okay.
So, that's pretty mainstream. He's also talking about using vitamin C, about using vitamin D, about using other supplements, not just medications, and that seems to be making a difference for the patient. So, Dr. Kyle Seidel is not on his own. There are other people out there that are seeing this, and this is what doctors do. When you see a problem, when what you're doing doesn't work, when the traditional approach doesn't work, then you need to do something else. That is the entire basis of my practice here in Ann Arbor. That's what we do, because people come here because the standard has not worked for them, and we try to figure out what's wrong with them. And that's what these doctors are doing. God bless them. That's what these doctors are doing in these ICUs and ERs, is trying to figure out better ways to do it. Sorry, but if you're waiting for the CDC to tell you what to do, I think that is the wrong approach. You got to listen to these people that are in the field, who are seeing what is working firsthand, and listen to what they're saying and start adapting that. And then maybe you can get the CDC in there to come up with some consensus for how we're going to treat this in the future.
So, Dr. Merrick, even in that email or whatever was put out, he said we need to be avoiding intubation and using ventilators at all costs. Obviously, it's the last ditch. If we're losing, we go there. But he's warning, do not start here. We need to try and prolong this, use every other means necessary. So clearly, this, I think, story is one of the biggest growing stories in medicine around COVID-19. It clearly is. There's a lot of science. There's studies now coming out that we were absolutely wrong. This does not appear to be a respiratory illness. This is much more like a blood illness, and we've got to now tack and move in a different direction. In your mind, I know that, as you said, in your clinic, you're looking at other things very quickly. When you look at this, when we're looking at oxygen, what are some of the things you might be thinking should be studied immediately as we move forward as possible treatments, if we know that the heme involvement, the iron, the binding of oxygen in red blood cells? What are some things that you would like to see studied immediately under these circumstances?
Well, one of the biggest things, if you're talking about the blood not being able to carry oxygen, that's going to bring up a couple of things. One is like altitude sickness, where you just don't have a lot of oxygen in the air, and so you're hypoxic because of that. And the other is the bends, where you get a bunch of small air bubbles that actually block blood flow, and you become hypoxic from that. The solution to both of those things is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Now, most hospitals have a chamber. Most hospitals have a chamber that they use to treat wounds and that sort of stuff. But you can put patients who are ill in these chambers for like an hour and a half at 100% oxygen, 2 atmospheres. The higher the pressure, the more oxygen you dissolve in the blood. You don't need hemoglobin for that. You can just have the blood carry the oxygen. And they did have a study, again, out of China. It was just a case series where they had 5 patients that they had on hyperbaric oxygen. They treated them for an hour and a half a day for 5 days. All 5 of them improved, and these were all critically ill patients. So they all improved significantly. So that seems to be one mechanism to change it. And the other thing to remember, too, is because of this, cytokine storm, I know you've spoken about this in your other show, because you have this cytokine storm, you get these tiny blood clots in the blood vessels. They're not going to carry blood the way they're supposed to. So most of these institutions are also using blood thinners, things to break up blood clots. And some people are even talking about using clot buster type drugs that we use for heart attacks. All right.
Wow.
And then the other big thing is, at the end of the day, you have to reduce the viral load. You want to keep working on what else can we use. We know that there's some evidence behind Plaquenil. Well, what about other drugs that are anti-protozoan like Plaquenil? So there's a paper out there on a drug called nitazoxanide. The brand name in the United States is Alinea. That appears to have similar benefits to the Plaquenil. So we should be looking at these things, not just saying, oh, it's dangerous. No, these are approved drugs in the United States. We're just using them off-label for things other than what they were approved for. And we do that all the time. I am tired of hearing people talk about how dangerous Plaquenil is. There are side effects to it like everything else, but it is a very safe drug. And you're talking about taking it for 5 or 6 days.
Right. Wow. Well, Dr. New, thank you for that incredible download. Thank you for your research on this. And obviously, you know, we'll bring you back on if there's any shift in this. I think that that brings a lot of clarity to what I think is perhaps one of the biggest stories in the world as we speak right now. So take care, keep up the good work, and hopefully we see more studies on things like hyperbaric and other drugs that may be able to address what now appears may not be the respiratory infection we thought it was. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dale.
You know, obviously, sharing a story like this is dangerous. We think about, you know, this is brand new territory. And here on the High Wire, like anywhere else, we don't want to get it wrong. But I also think that it's important to think about what Dr. Kyle Seidel is saying. We need the ability to, as a world, work together in moments like this, to bring the great scientific minds. It shouldn't have had to wait until, you know, this Dr. MD, months into this issue, where now tens of thousands of people have died around the world, to find out that we may actually be killing them because we are going about this the exact wrong way. We are using the wrong protocols. But this fear, this concern amongst doctors to speak out, to speak to each other, the fear for people in media to be able to tell the truth, and more and more and more, we are seeing this dangerous move into censorship, where people, you know, like Dr. Seidel, that maybe goes on YouTube, is at risk of having that video taken down because it does not fit the protocol or the paradigm that our government agencies want you to believe in, that the CDC wants you to believe in. You see now how dangerous it is to have the CDC saying to YouTube and Google and these places, don't allow any information. Call it, go ahead and say that it's a conspiracy and decisions like that. We may be on the verge of watching citizens, and because doctors can speak to each other, actually making a gigantic difference right now, which is why I really want to plead with you. If you're watching the High Wire for the first time, or if you've been, watching us for a long time, there's a really good chance that doing stories like this is going to get us kicked off of YouTube. It's going to get us kicked off of Facebook. So when you come next week and you look for us and we're not there, we need to be able to continue to communicate with you, and you need to be able to continue to communicate with us. So whether or not you're donating and helping us do the work we're due, here's what I would really love for you to do today. Please supply us with your email. Go to thehighwire.com and go /watch. On that page, at the bottom of the page, it just says subscribe to our email list. We are not going to be burying your email with the sale of drugs or the sale of even vitamins or water purification systems or gasoline or anything like that. We simply would like to have your email. Should we come into a crisis moment in this nation that is descending into oppression as we speak, you know it's happening. You cannot even go out in a park right now without getting arrested. These are dangerous times, folks, and we need the freedom of speech to be available to us. That may mean that at some point, if we're censored, you want to be able to find us. We would like to be able to say to you, we have been shut down in the places you're used to seeing us. Here's where you're going to find us. We are not going to stop, but they could do serious harm to free speech if we can't get to you. So please take the time today and just sign up to our email list. And guess what? I have a little bonus for you if you do it this week. If you sign up to our email list, you're going to get a little video that we just simply couldn't fit into the show. I went out and got tested for COVID-19 this week. Here's a little taste of what that moment was like for me.
This is really weird. It's like being in a science, it's like outbreak or something like that, with all these people around with masks. And imagine if this becomes mandatory. All right, we're in the tent now. There we go. So here we are. We're waiting for 15 minutes to find out, have I had COVID-19? Have I not? It makes me wonder, in government, are they thinking about the repercussions of people testing all over the country? And what you believe about illness. Natural health people see this very differently than people that are very pro-pharma and use drugs and take vaccines. And all of the different types of people that are going through this scenario right now are going to have to find some way to move forward with each other. Here we go.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon. I see that you came in for COVID testing today.
Yeah.
There's testing for 2 antibodies there, IgG and IgM.
Okay.
So you...
Dope! I got you. If you want to see how that turns out, if you want to know if I've tested positive or negative or what's going on inside of this body right here, you have to sign up to our email list and you will see that entire 5-minute video that goes through all of my thoughts and concerns as I went through that process and what I now know about my condition here in the United States of America. So please sign up to our email list right away. It is only there so that we can keep the channels of true communication and real news open. Speaking of real news, let me bring in Jeffrey Jackson to go over what actually happened in the last 7 days since our last episode of The High Wire. Jeffrey, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Del. Thanks for having me.
All right. First of all, I rarely get to point this out, but not only are you doing all of this great research for us and following what's going on the High Wire, there's so often times that I can't cover everything that we're talking about, and you've been writing you have an incredible blog going on at thehighwire.com called The Jackson Report that is bringing nuance and deeper facts and points to many of the things I'm talking about. So I want to thank you for that work, and everyone should know you really got to stay in tune with The Jackson Report every week. For those of you that know how to read, it's really a great way to get your information. All right, Jeffrey, what happened this week?
Well, let's like we normally start. Let's go over the numbers. So
okay.
The U.S. has a little over 432,000 cases and 14,000 deaths. Below that is Spain and then Italy. Spain has 152,000 cases. Italy has about 139,000 cases. But what's really interesting here with the numbers is I think everyone should pay attention to what Dr. Deborah Birx said. She's part of Trump's coronavirus task force.
Okay.
And she recently made an announcement that regardless of any underlying health issue that could have contributed to the loss of someone's life, they're going to count someone that dies with COVID-19 as dying of COVID-19. So this is a very interesting point because we know that a lot of from the research, the cases of people that are dying from this or catching it as well have underlying health conditions. These are people typically older.
And this is what we've been reporting on, right? This is exactly, we talked about the death certificate. We said it looks like they are trying to bolster the numbers. And in fact, I think we have the video of her saying exactly that. Let's take a look at this.
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem. Some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
It's amazing when you report something and say that this is what is clear. When we showed you the death certificate last week, that they are promoting the idea, forget that they had cancer and were in ICU anyway, or forget that they had an underlying, heart disease and condition that was probably going to claim their life this year. We just want to see this as a COVID-19 death. I've been talking about this in my house, and my 11-year-old son actually asked me the question. He's like, so Dad, if someone's in a car accident and they end up chopping off their arms and legs and they're now in the ER and they end up bleeding to death, but while they're in there, they're tested positive for COVID-19, are they going to call that a COVID-19 death? And I honestly think, I looked at my 11-year-old son and said, you know what? It's a really good question. Based on what we're seeing here, they do not care if it's COVID-19. you know, if you're dying with it, then you're dying from it, it flies in the face of what we're told coming out of Italy, right? That in Italy, they said when they went back, they clearly saw that 88% of the cases, you had to say those underlying conditions are what killed them, not the COVID-19. So they're really bolstering these numbers. They are really, and they're saying it right to our faces. We are going to blow these numbers up. In fact, you have a couple other reports that show reasons they might also, in ways they might be bloating this. You know, what's that about?
Yeah, well, another possible angle is the CARES Act. This was the stimulus package, the third phase of the stimulus package passed last week and signed by Trump. The CARES Act reimburses hospitals' Medicare rates for the care of uninsured COVID-19 patients. It also adds 20% increase in Medicare reimbursements for COVID-19 hospitalizations. So these are two data points that are very interesting when you start looking at these data numbers.
So they're actually saying, if you call it a COVID-19 death, we're sending more money your way. You don't have to worry about if that person in the ER is uninsured. Don't worry about it. They'll be covered as long as it was COVID-19, and we're seeing a big problem with this. We're seeing doctors, and I'm not going to get deep into this because we know it's happening now. This is now becoming a mainstream discussion that the High Wire shared just last week. We see doctors speaking out against this, saying, this is insane. I've never had to do this before. Yes, I've had patients in the past that were dying of heart disease or lung disease or cancer that had the flu, but they didn't tell me I had to call it a flu death because that made no sense. And now they're tying my arms behind my back. You can go online and see these videos everywhere. All right, let's talk about the numbers. Where are we at? What else has happened this week?
Well, there's been a big pushback towards the World Health Organization. It started, I mean, arguably wherever it started, but last week we saw the Deputy Prime Minister in Japan come out and really rail against the World Health Organization. In the article, he said, quote, people think the World Health Organization should change its name. Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso said while speaking in the Japanese parliament on Wednesday. According to translators, it should be called it shouldn't be called the WHO. It should be called the CHO, which was the China's health organization. Wow. So those are big words to say in a parliament by a Deputy Prime Minister. And then right after that, you have President Trump. This was 2 days ago on Tuesday. He came out and said that he announced that they were going to cut funding, the U.S. funding to the World Health Organization. He later backed it off a little bit, but the president's 2021 fiscal budget package does have in there that they're going to take away from 122 million that's the U.S. is funding the World Health Organization. They're going to bring that down to 58 million. And the U.S. is the largest funder of the WHO, which is something that I wasn't even aware of.
I mean, amazing when you think that the WHO really has been driving this entire discussion. Everything we knew coming out of China came through the WHO. I saw Donald Trump clearly upset, feeling like either he was lied to or there's total incompetence. I was listening to the Secretary of State Pompeo say yesterday that, you know, look it, America pays for services. The reason we pay for those services is that they have to be accurate and they've got to do their job. And if they're not doing their job well, what are we paying for? So I think it's a gigantic question now around the World Health Organization. And when we start thinking about Bill Gates, who is a giant funder of the World Health Organization and seems to be using the WHO as some form of microphone to the rest of the world, I think we have to start wondering who's running who's telling the truth. Is China in charge? Is Gates using China, WHO? Really, really big questions we're going to continue to look into. I think it's a fascinating story. What else we got? I mean, geez, it's amazing, right? Every single day, the news is just exploding. What else?
It's incredible. One last side note on that. We will come back to the WHO before we're done here. But there was a change.org petition to remove the Director General, Dr. Tedros. I'm sorry, he's not a doctor. He's the first WHO Director General that's not a doctor. Wow. Had about over 770,000 signatures so far, and that started in January, end of January. So there's a lot of growing discontent there. But moving on to Austria. So Austria and even Denmark, they are announcing plans. You know, everyone's saying, when is this quarantine going to let up? This is the big news now as we're going into weeks and weeks upon this. Austria and Denmark are planning to lift restrictions in stages. So Austria wants to start with small shops. They're slated to reopen April 14th, and then larger stores to follow, hopefully on May 1st. So we're seeing we're seeing those two countries making a move, a positive move, to try to reopen their economy. Meanwhile, U.S., Germany, Britain, they're talking about proposing splitting up the population with immune and non-immune people.
Wow.
So
April 14th.
We had something came out from the St. Louis Fed. They're proposing a daily test to get back to work, to start the economy. So this was out of St. Louis. President James Bullard laid out a system where every American would be tested every day, and they would wear a badge where they would show, kind of like after they vote, he said, that they would show their immune status, which is an interesting proposal. But we see a lot of the health and immune response and antibody response being tied in now with getting back to work. Can you work? That's the big thing. And Robert Redfield, director of the CDC, just came out. This was today, and they announced that essential workers can go back to work. This is healthcare workers. This is food supply workers. Yep. And they just need regular temperature checks. They have to adhere to social distancing. They have to wear masks, so on and so forth.
Wow, incredible. So a huge shift, and now we are starting to see nations decide it may be time to end this lockdown and move back into society. I mean, it's really scary out there, right? I mean, I think all of us, if you have any working brain cells, so much of this sounds so scary. When we hear about snitches, like I think in California, right, they're saying, you know, you're going to be benefited by snitching on your neighbor if they're breaking the protocols. We're seeing advertisements for bracelets and things you might wear as you walk down the street to say that you are COVID negative or COVID positive or whatever your situation is. I mean, you know, bands and epaulets and things. I mean, from Nazi Germany into Orwellian, you know, science fiction novels, it's happening. It's here. These discussions are real. Really, really incredible. Is there anything else you have to report?
Well, just, you know, as we reported last week, we had the jobless claims. They do come out on Thursday here. So we had another 6.61 million jobless claims, and that makes 16.8 million Americans have filed unemployment benefits in the last 3 weeks. So
60% won't be able to meet their basic financial needs. Wow. That's an incredible headline.
So as you said last week, not surprising, but incredible nonetheless. And you know, let's go back just to end on the World Health Organization. Okay. We have their assistant director or executive director of the Health Emergency Program. His name is Dr. Michael Ryan. He made an announcement and said that the countries may look at going into people's homes, essentially finding sick people and removing them with dignity, of course, and safety. But this is an interesting statement coming from a policy, you know, setting organization that kind of puts out this message. And I'm not sure if there's a video of that, but it's interesting to hear him say.
Let's take a look at it.
In low incidence areas where there are sporadic cases or clusters, we advise that all contacts should be quarantined. Ideally, that quarantine should occur in a place other than the home. Most of the transmission that's actually happening in many countries now is happening in the household, at family level. In some senses, transmission has been taken off the streets and pushed back into family units. Now we need to go and look in families to find those people who may be sick and remove them and isolate them in a safe and dignified manner.
Wow, a safe and dignified manner. Can you imagine? I mean, imagine Chris Cuomo being dragged out of his house. We don't trust you in there. And I think in some ways, it really even defies reason. If we think that the children and those that are young are going to just have a cold, why isn't the WHO just saying, just stay in the house? Go ahead, let everyone in the house, have everything delivered, let everyone get it so that you'll have, you know, your titers, you'll be immune now for life, or at least for several years in the future. Instead, are we literally talking about going door to door, testing family members, watching mothers or fathers or children? What if the child is the one that has it and the parents don't? Are you going to watch your child dragged off? What would you do If the CDC or some representative for the United States government comes to your house, tests that your child is positive, they have absolutely no decent symptoms, they're perfectly healthy, they're running around in quarantine, jumping on the backyard trampoline, then now the CDC says, I'm sorry, we're going to have to take your 11-year-old child or your 5-year-old child or maybe even your teenager away and stick them into quarantine. I can't believe that these are the types of statements that are being made. And certainly if that's what's coming from the WHO, then I hope Donald Trump will look deeper into whether we should be funding them or not. Jeffrey, thank you so much for bringing us that incredible report and what happened last week. Keep up the good work. And for more of your information, we're all going to be reading the Jackson report this week.
All right. Thanks, Del.
All right. Take care. All right. I want to very quickly sort of go over the new numbers now, because as Jeffrey Jackson has reported, we're seeing headlines like this all over the place, where we were supposed to be in the middle of what looked like was going to be the peak for the next 2 weeks. More people are going to die, more cases, but then it should eventually plateau. It actually seems like the opposite is true. Here's some of the headlines that we saw this week. New York Times. New York Times, New York virus deaths hit new high, but hospitalizations are slowing down. We also saw this headline, virus toll in New York region shows signs of leveling off. And, all right, great. And then this, I think, is a very important headline. One of the big modelers out of Washington, IHME, the model reduces once again. Last week we were told it's going to be 100,000 to 200,000 deaths. And now the projection is 30,000 to 120,000 deaths. That means the median death rate appears to be somewhere around 60,000 deaths. Fascinating. Since what we have been reporting for over a month now on the high wire was that the death rate is going to come in somewhere like the flu. All around the world, the numbers were showing us this looks just like the flu. And though maybe people said we were crazy here on the high wire and you weren't hearing that on any other mainstream outlet in the world, you were hearing these gigantic numbers. We've watched as the imperial model comes crashing down, every model crashing down, as we seem to see this rejiggering, this reconfiguration, as they try to explain how they were so wrong. And now, once again, in less than 7 days from the last model, we're cutting it in half again. Folks, do you recognize that, as time goes by, more and more these models and these modelers and our top scientific officials are getting closer and closer and closer to where the scientific, medical, and stat team we have here at the High Wire, maybe we were right from the beginning. I can't wait to see how close we are or were when this all comes together. But very quickly, let's look at what's happening in New York, which is this epicenter we're all watching in America and I think around the world. It appears that New York may really be that last gigantic push. Probably the highest death rate we know in the world of any city is really in New York right now. So let's look at those numbers, shall we? All right. This is when we're looking at the intake at the ER. This is the influenza-like illnesses. You can see there that back in on 3/2020 was the peak, and now that we're moving into April, I think this is what are we getting this? April 6th, April 7th, April 7th right now. Look at that. The flu, the people that are saying they have flu-like incidents going on is crashed. It's way, way, way down. And again, when you look at these peaks, we're looking out over years, right? We're looking at 2017. Look at the peak of what we hit. It's really on par, maybe just a little bit more than your average flu season that we see back there in 2018. This is exactly what we've been reporting. You don't see something that's 3 times, 5 times the death rate or intake rate is what we're looking at here. It's right on par with what we see, maybe a slight bit higher. But now, unlike what we were told by Donald Trump and by the Fauci and Birx and the modelers from Washington, it isn't continuing to increase. We're seeing it drop over the last several days. Other interesting info when we look at that ER data, let's take a look at this. This is respiratory illnesses. These would be other reasons you might be coming in. Remember, there's nothing, when we look this up, there's no way to look at COVID-19 intakes. You have to sort of break it down into what they list them as. Respiratory illnesses are crashing way, way, way down. A couple of other things we looked at. Asthma, way, way, way down. In fact, if you look at diarrhea and vomiting and all these other things, everything is going down, down, down. In fact, I believe that was a quote by James Redfield, by the CDC, saying the models are going to be off, the numbers are way, way, way down. Then, of course, this chart, so important. We showed it to you last week. When we hear about Deborah Birx saying we're going to count everybody, no matter what the underlying conditions as a COVID-19 death, once again, these are the numbers. If you look at that category of no underlying conditions, at the end, only 76 people died that didn't have underlying conditions. And once again, we see most of these over the age of 45, 65, 75, young children 0 to 17, really no issue with this whatsoever, which is going to get to a greater point later on because very soon, coming up, I am going to speak with a world-famous biomathematician and modeler himself, Knut Witkowski. But before I do, before we get to that, and talk about, how these numbers are being manipulated and what do they actually mean. And by the way, if all of these numbers are going down, aren't we all asking ourselves, when is this lockdown going to end? What do you need to see? What are we waiting for? That's going to come up. You're going to get answers to that, at least from a top world mathematician here in just a little bit. But first, I want to talk about something we really started discussing last week, which is here on the High Wire, we present you with the facts. If you watch the High Wire, all you have to do right now is type in ICAN if you're watching this on Facebook, and we're going to provide you with the data and the links to the information that we're sharing with you, at least all the information we can fit onto that bot. If you want to be a recurring donor, that would be really great, because at the end of every week, everybody that is a recurring donor, we're asking people to give us $20 for 2020 to be able to do the work that we're doing, not funded by pharma, not funded by any government agency. Donate $20 a month, just like you do for Netflix or anything else, and help us do this work. We're hiring researchers all around the world that are bringing you the best information you have found anywhere in America, so help us do that. But even if you're only donating 50 cents or $1 a month, if you're a recurring donor, everything we are sharing with you, all of the videos, all of the links will be presented to you at the end of every week with a newsletter. So join us, join the High Wire team investigating. We are all in this together, and many of you are reporting to me, sending in emails that help us find these breaking stories as they're going on. But that's how we do the news. We make sure that we're getting the truth. We're showing you the real numbers, the real graphs. Meanwhile, on mainstream, we are still seeing manipulations. We are seeing what Donald Trump could easily describe as fake news. In one instance this week, we watched CBS reporting a nurse putting out that a nurse had come forward crying, saying, I had to leave my hospital. There's not enough PPE, not enough mask and protection to protect me. Put out by CBS there. And we only find out because I believe it was Reddit went and did an investigation that she actually had left her job in that hospital. Oh, this is the Federalist. I'm sorry, the Federalist did it. CBS News post fraudulent video of ICU nurse crying over poor working conditions. The truth was she had left the job a year earlier. We also saw a video piece that was trying to, again, promote the dangers. Even though we're showing you the numbers are going down, mainstream media is still trying to hype up your fear. And in one little piece of the video, they're showing you an ICU where someone's being intubated. I think we have a piece of that video. Take a look at this.
The New York governor today begged President Trump to send help now, saying he'd been forced to buy ventilators from China because it was like bidding on eBay to secure enough in his own country. Overwhelmed hospital workers, he says, deserve more.
Now, they're probably counting on the fact that that went whipping through there really quickly, but most of you could have paused it. And if you did, or if you saw some of the reports on this, that's a mannequin laying there. They're literally using footage of a mannequin on a story about ventilation and how New York needs ventilators. And then it ends up being a shot of a mannequin. I mean, these are the types of things and manipulations. Reuters is the one. Here's the one that Reuters calls it out. Partly false claim. Video shows doctors operating on a dummy to exaggerate extent of coronavirus crisis. But I think perhaps for me, one of the most sort of egregious, if not untrue, certainly a manipulation of the truth took place, and I believe was an attack on chloroquine. Remember, trials going on all around the entire world and in this country, in New York, doctors coming forward saying that, you know, they're having so much success with chloroquine in their own trials, some of them anecdotal, some of them actually in trials, but there's still this attack upon chloroquine by the press, and I think that's what this headline was really all about. This was Huffington Post. Donald Trump has staken hydroxychloroquine drug maker. This is a report. The president has repeatedly touted the anti-malarial drug as a coronavirus treatment despite a lack of medical evidence. So I've never seen anything like it. I've told you that we know that mainstream media is funded by the pharmaceutical industry. 50 to 70% of all advertising, those ads for plaque psoriasis and everything else going wrong with you, and a drug that can help you, is what is funding your news anchors. But now when they're going actively out of their way after a drug, it's the first time I've ever seen anything like it. It makes you wonder why. And in this case, many people may think they were going after Donald Trump, but why is that your story when we're hearing doctors still reporting things like this week when it comes to chloroquine?
What we're finding clinically with our patients is that it really only works in conjunction with zinc. So the hydroxychloroquine opens the zinc channel, zinc goes into the cell, it then blocks the replication of the cellular machinery. So it has to be used in conjunction with zinc. We are seeing some clinical responses in that regard. There are people that take it regularly for other disease processes. We have to be cautious and mindful that we don't prescribe it for patients who have COVID that are well. It really should be reserved for people that are really sick in the hospital or at home very sick that need that medication. Otherwise, we're going to blow through our supply for the patients that take it regularly for other disease processes.
But what you're saying is you're prescribing it and it is working for COVID-19 patients.
Every patient I've prescribed it to has been very, very ill, and within 8 to 12 hours, they were basically symptom-free. And so clinically, I am seeing a resolution. That mirrors what we saw in the French study and some of the other studies worldwide.
I mean, amazing. Is it shocking to you when you have doctors reporting? We've been reporting on this for almost 2 months now, that chloroquine is showing has hopeful signs, and now we're getting more details that it's the addition of zinc, that chloroquine appears to be opening up the cells so that zinc can get in there. Donald Trump repeated those points. Why is the media then trying to make a deal out of Donald Trump being invested in chloroquine? My understanding is it's a $6 pill, and we're talking about something that, as Dr. Neuenschwander maybe you use over 5 or 6 days, but you know, it's a question, and you know, if the president is invested in this, then we should want to know. I want to bring in a great filmmaker, an incredible journalist, Mike Cernovich, who made the movie Hoax, that was about exactly these types of issues, an embellishment of the truth. In some ways, some call it fake news. Mike, you've been watching this whole thing over these last several weeks. What's going on in your mind as we're watching these headlines?
Well, we're learning more than ever that you have to look behind the headlines. You can't just trust what they say. For example, the New York Times reported that Donald Trump had a financial interest in a pharmaceutical company that made chloroquine. And I go, well, that's interesting. I wonder what that is. And then I went through and pulled up Trump's financial disclosure and then the prospectus for the mutual fund that he owned. And you realized it's maybe $100, maybe $200, some kind of trivial amount. And so what's frustrating
wait. Take it back.
about,
Take it back. Are you telling me there are headlines about the fact that there may be a vested interest of our president, that he is only talking about chloroquine because he has an investment in it? And run those numbers by me again and how you found them?
Sure. So the New York Times wrote this big article that trended on Twitter, top story, blockbuster, the Orange Man, Orange Man is bad, we got him again. And in it, they said that he owned a stake in Sanofi, which is a French pharmaceutical company. And I thought, wow, okay, that's interesting. And people are going nuts. I can't believe it. People that I respect, by the way. This was
sent to me too.
Yeah, people that I'm like, wow, this is a credible person. Lawyers that if my life were on the line, I would hire. And I'm like, okay, I wonder what's really going on. I'll look into it. And then I go, well, let me find Trump's financial disclosures. And it turns out the disclosures will give a range of what he owns. And it said that he owned between $1,000 and $15,000 in a Dodge and Cox mutual fund. I'm like, okay, so at most he owns 1,000 to 15,000.
Oh, here we go. Yep.
And then I went to the Dodge and Cox prospectus for that fund, and 2.9% of that fund is invested in the stock of the company that makes chloroquine, which, by the way, is generic. So there's a whole rabbit hole you go down. But if you just look at the very numbers, you're talking about Trump indirectly, at most, owns a couple $100 in the maker of chloroquine via a mutual fund that nobody knows what's in your mutual fund anyway.
Right, nobody does.
Right, and then when you go further down the rabbit hole, you realize it's generic drug anyway. The pharmaceutical maker has been giving it away. They've been giving everything they can anyhow. So we're talking, $10, $20, $30. But that was the blockbuster story of the night. And as so often happens, every time you look behind a story, you're just, what is this? There's nothing behind it.
And it's not like the news is want for dramatic stories to tell to try to get you to tune in, right? I mean, there is plenty of drama out there. What this says to me is either a team of people or at least one very dogged reporter went so far out of their way on a mission to try to find some connection to chloroquine, which says to me, Mike, someone is sending them on that mission, right? Someone is saying to the media, we've got to knock down this chloroquine thing, so see if you can find some connection between Donald Trump. And you and I are both reporters. This is how this works, right? This is what this tells us. Behind the scenes, someone's got it out for chloroquine. Am I wrong?
You're not. I mean, here's the way to look at it. There were 4 reporters on the byline, including Ken Vogel, who is, in fact, an excellent reporter. So I would love to see who told him, hey, but because he's one of the few reporters that I respect in the corporate media. And I was like, Ken, what is his name doing on this article? And here's what's worse. And I wrote about this in another article at Cernovich.com. They're all omitting off-label use. Untested drug, unproven drug. No, it isn't untested. It is tested. It is proven. It's been used for how many years? People take it like, in some cases, when you're traveling to Africa, you take it the way you might take a seasick medication because of its antimalarial functions. So it isn't untested. It is unproven. And then you read it. What I do when I teach people to look at the news is how many articles about chloroquine mention off-label use? None. They just say, well, the FDA hasn't narrowly approved it in a study that takes 7 years of the drug, but off-label use is completely appropriate. So there is some kind of targeted attack on this.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that story to us, Mike, and of course, digging deep. I know that takes work to get, all the way through to how the mutual fund work and the breakdown. I think that was really important because once again, here we are watching the manipulation of the news. Okay, I guess you could say he's invested in Sanofi, in a little tiny particle in a mutual fund. He has a few $1,000s in, so $29 to $435. Hardly something that I think we call Trump a billionaire. Hardly something that should really be on the Richter scale of importance. Mike, you do a lot of research like this. How do we follow the work that you're doing? Because I know you like to do the investigation to make sure you get it right. So where can we find you in the work that you're doing?
Sure. So I just released a movie, Hoaxed Movie, which covers the whole history of media as propaganda. We talk about everything from how wars have been started to the modern narratives that we see that often end up not being true. And we talk about it philosophically and broad-based, but we use specific stories. So, for example, if we were doing a sequel to Hoaxed, we would talk about this chloroquine story. We would talk about how the media, they mislead you, how they leave out material information, how they spin things way out of context to make things look that much worse than it already is, which, as you guys all know, I've done reporting on SB 76 in California. That's how I kind of found my way into, your work. Is I've just been reading reporting that was talking about people like they were just monsters. And I thought, well, okay, there's monsters meeting in California and Sacramento. I might as well get on a plane.
That's a news story.
Meet them. Yeah. And that's what led me into this world is you read about the whole group of people who are demonized. And now what's so amazing is that same group of people is being demonized about coronavirus, which came from China, but already people are trying to blame the people that they, the vaccine people or whatever, the terms that they use, the slurs.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are you talking about? There's no vaccine even yet. There's not even a debate to be had, but they're already like, we're going to tee up on these people who have nothing to do with this virus. China does. And so my reporting is, whenever you tell me these people are the worst of the worst, I'm like, well, okay, then that's where I want to go. I want to meet those people, because and that's what you notice too, because you've done reporting too, is your background's reporting, is that's where the stories are.
Yeah.
And now so much of the news is not about the people being reported on. So much of the news is like meta news, where you have to debunk all of the stories that the news is telling you about these other people.
Right. People you don't meet, ER rooms you're not in, images from other countries being placed in as though they came from here. Mike, thank you for that great report. And, hopefully we can get you on more often. It's been a lot of fun, and certainly great to see the actual numbers. So keep up the good work, and hopefully everyone out there, I think I've watched Hoax. It's a great film. And it really does lay out the tricks that they use in the media. I used to be in that media, remember. I worked for the Doctors television show. I won an Emmy Award, though I felt very ethical in most of what we did on that show. I'm very, very proud of. There are tricks and things that are used to try and heighten the sensation, and sometimes we're a little bit outside of where the facts may be. So take care, Mike. Keep up the good work.
My pleasure.
And it really, you got to start asking yourself, for some reason, there is an attack on the ability for chloroquine to possibly work. And we are getting more details. Now we know that perhaps the zinc part of it, or erythromycin, really helped to make the whole, cocktail work. But why would the media want to strike down the only thing we have in our hands right now? Why would we want to keep something that could save someone's life today, if it could, especially if it's already been proven safe? As Mike described, you use it just like you would an or a motion sickness pill. Why are they gunning after it? Is there a chance that it gets in the way of the narrative that somehow, if we can cure this, then the death numbers go down, and maybe we have to end the social distancing? Maybe we can go back to work because we're able to actually cure this very tiny percent. Remember, they're now, and we reported this over, I think, last week, they're saying this is maybe 0.6%, under 1% for sure. And even Dr. Tony Fauci and James Redfield from the CDC are saying it looks like it very well may be just like the flu, so somewhere in the 0.16 space. And we're all asking ourselves, then if that's the case, and you have a cure that people don't die, and especially now that we're finding out that many of those deaths may be attributed to what we look back historically and say was some form of malpractice, or at least mistaken or accidental practice, where we were using intubation and ventilators when that was what was killing people. I mean, so much. You can see why this show is so important. You can see why these facts are really, as I said, are really going to fly in the face of the paradigm that we're being sold on CNN. Every time we tune in to Deborah Birx and Tony Fauci and Donald Trump standing there, who he seems to be trying to understand this information as they're spewing it in the microphones, is any of it true? The last-ditch effort, it seems to me, is to try and tell us, well, sure, the numbers are going down. They're really, really going down. The imperial model was off by 2,400% or more, but that's because of social distancing. It was the social distancing that did it. It was the fact that we quarantine ourselves. And I've showed you scientists all across the world have spoken out against that. And one of my favorites, Dr. Peter Gutcha, who founded the Cochrane Collaboration, say, be careful. We have already always known this was just another coronavirus. The numbers were going to be very low. Don't let them tell you that these draconian measures are why they are low. They made a mistake. Well, this week, a video came out from a world-renowned biomathematician, modeler, Knut Witkowski. He came out, and there was a 1-hour video out there that was extremely compelling, complaining about the fact that why aren't mathematicians involved in this process? Why was it just virologists and MDs? What does the WHO actually know? Was the imperial model totally off, and how long ago did mathematicians know it? I had the opportunity to sit down and talk to Knut Witkowski yesterday. Let me just show you some of this guy's credentials so we have a sense of who we're talking about. This is the founder of Asdera, former head of biostatistics, epidemiology, and research design, Center for Clinical and Translational Science at the Rockefeller University, former senior research associate biometrician, consultant of the New York Academy of Medicine, associate HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies, guest researcher, Centers for Disease Control, DCS, Medical Biometry, University of Tübingen, and PhD Computer Science, University of Stuttgart. This guy has more letters around his name and background. That's why what he is saying really, really is so powerful. And it is aligning with, as I told you, there is no longer scientific consensus in the world. And there is certainly not mathematical consensus. And that's what I got to when I sat down and had this conversation with Knut Witkowski. I hope you enjoy it. You better be ready to take notes. Grab your pen, grab your paper. I think you're about to get a huge dose of what sounds a lot like sense. I want to thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.
You know, you're kind of an immediate internet sensation right now. You wrote a paper recently discussing what you think might be a better approach to COVID-19. Currently, we are all locked down around the world, different variations of it. I think Sweden is the only nation I know of that actually, has avoided any sort of form of lockdown. But in your paper, you described what you thought would be the best approach. Could you go ahead and explain that to me? How do you think we should be dealing with COVID-19?
Well, we shouldn't really deal with it. We should just let nature take its course. And the only thing we should do is we should try to make sure that the elderly and the vulnerable don't get in contact with people who could be infected. So they should isolate until the whole thing is over, and that shouldn't take more than 4 weeks. There is no evidence around that doing any of these antisocial separation or prohibition or whatever you call it has any effect on the epidemic. With one exception, it flattening the curve, what people try to do, is broadening it. And that means it takes more time. And if it takes more time, in the end, you are putting more people at risk because nobody can, for extended periods of time, follow these draconic strategies or measurements.
I'm not against the quarantine if there's really, truly a deadly epidemic for some reason sweeping the planet, but we need to right that ship once we've discovered that the death rate's not what we thought it was going to be. Would you agree with that point, or do you think, was there enough of a panic up front to sort of start a lockdown?
Very early on, yes. Very early on, we didn't know anything. But now we have already seen the epidemic in the United States taking half of its course, so it has already peaked. And about 12,000 people have died. Make it another 12,000, that would be 24 or 25,000. That would still be lower than the average number of people dying during a regular flu season.
We are, going into a month now of lockdown or more. We're looking at a few more weeks to say in the end of April. How long would this entire thing have lasted had we gone with your approach and just said, hands off, let it run its course like other flu seasons? How long to reach that herd immunity point in your mind?
It would be over.
We'd already be through it.
Yep. The same way it did in China, it did in South Korea, it did in Australia, it did in Austria. We have lots of these examples. This is what the epidemics do. And there is no reason to expect it would be fundamentally different in the United States. It may take a bit more time because the United States is so big, so the virus doesn't get everywhere at the same time. There's a delay of a couple of days before it gets from one place to the other. And therefore it can take a bit more time, but that's not a major factor in the whole discussion.
We keep hearing about a second wave, that we now have to prepare for the second wave probably coming in the fall. Do you predict that that's something we should be preparing for? And how do you think we should prepare, if so?
We should prepare by stopping the prohibition as soon as possible, and then we have a good chance that there will be no second wave. If there is a second wave, it is because the shutdown was preventing herd immunity to build. And then if the summer is over and people stay more time indoors, then the virus will start spreading again. And the way to prevent that is to let the virus run its course right now and be done with it.
What would be your definition of herd immunity?
That enough people had contact with the virus to be immune. And if the majority of people is immune, then there is no risk for somebody else coming in to spread the virus. And then the epidemic is over.
At what point did you break away from believing in the imperial model? How early on did you start suspecting it was wrong?
From the very beginning, I never believed in it.
Why?
Well, because it didn't make any sense. And the problem is some people put out models that have no relation to reality, and then you can prove everything, including the opposite. We should use models that are actually grounded in reality. And if we do that, we get realistic estimates. They can be 10% too high or even 20%, but they will not be off by several orders of magnitude.
When you say proper models or using real numbers, I think around the world we assumed that's what was being used. What were these models built on?
I have no clue, because I couldn't see any information that would allow me to evaluate what type of model was used, other than it started with M and ended with Odle. No qualified or very few qualified epidemiologists were ever being consulted. It was all virologists and MDs, and they are not really trained in understanding the complex nonlinear systems that drive epidemics and that you have to incorporate in your thinking to make sense of the data.
Is there something specific about a respiratory disease that means we should lock down more than other illnesses? Are respiratory diseases more dangerous when we look back historically?
The influenza and coronavirus and other respiratory diseases, they all have very similar characteristics. There's nothing different between this coronavirus and previous coronaviruses, and the epidemic looks very much the same as the epidemic of influenza viruses. It's all the same. They come, they say for a moment, and then they drop, and that happens naturally, and it doesn't really require very much of an intervention.
Deborah Birx is now saying that they are going to put a code, the death code for coronavirus, on every single person that dies with coronavirus, despite whatever, whether they had some other comorbid issues that could have been deadly. Does that make the job harder for someone like you? Does that hurt our ability to really figure out what happened here if we're coding everything as COVID, even if there's a potential they died of a heart disease or a diabetes or something that was surely going to kill them otherwise this year?
Yes, it makes it much more difficult. It's one of the two things that make it difficult. The other thing that makes it difficult is when people are changing the strategy of collecting data in the midst of an epidemic, or changing the definition in the midst of an epidemic. Immediately following that, you see a huge spike or drop or some other change that has nothing to do with the epidemic, only with the reporting system.
So when we're looking at these graphs, we do see these dramatic spikes at times, or it goes up, or these high points. Is that naturally how viruses work? Do we see things
No.
spike and then they go down and come back for a while?
No, nature doesn't jump. Darwin said that. Nature doesn't jump. Epidemics go smoothly. They incline, they peak, and they decline, and they don't jump back and forth all the time.
Can you explain to me why we see these spikes in these graphs?
Well, if somebody finds, I said that before, a shoebox with reports that should have been reported and wasn't, and then sends the shoebox in, or scans the data or whatever, then suddenly there's a spike.
Makes sense. Or if suddenly one day you say this is the official code and everybody goes and grabs all their logs and then codes it, we could see a spike there too.
Yes. And we have seen that happen. We have seen that happening in China originally. So they had one of these enormous spikes, and everybody cuts off the graph because otherwise you can't see anything anymore. And then it turned, they changed the definition of what the case is. And actually, they changed it to the worse. And that's now being incorporated into many other strategies, including into what the CDC now advises people, that there should not be a test and an examination whether it was actually the virus that contributed to the death. As long as somebody dies and you find some virus, whether it had an effect or not, it's still being considered a coronavirus disease case, and that is ridiculous, but that's what it is. It makes, as you said, it makes our life much more difficult, but luckily epidemics end fast. So if we can stop the nonsense of the prohibition 100 years after the other prohibition, if we can stop that, then what we will have is the virus will just go within a couple of weeks and it will all be over.
When you look at everything you watch on the television right now, it's saying because of this lockdown, we have been able to stave off the inevitable. Now they're talking about next fall. We're going to have to prepare again. Are you concerned that we have turned a corner into a new way to deal with these viruses that could see us in quarantine more often in the future?
Okay, the first thing is there is no evidence anywhere in the world that a lockdown had any positive effect. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that it is negative, that flattening the curve prolonged it and prevents herd immunity from building up. And if herd immunity is not building up, then whenever you stop the intervention, you see the epidemic do what it couldn't do before, and that is you see the number of infections or the number of cases rising again. Not as high as it before was, but it would rise again, and then people get scared again, and they start the same thing over again. And this is how you create these rebounds and these waves, and you can keep it going for a year or more just by reinstating doing these lockdowns.
So we could be starting a dangerous cycle in your mind?
Oh, if we hadn't done this, it would be over.
When I look at Tony Fauci and I look at Deborah Birx, when I see Bill Gates out there saying things like he wants to lock us down hard for 10 more weeks or something, or that we're going to have to keep using these measures, when living in this country, what is your thought about that approach? And are you shocked more scientists aren't stepping up to say we need to stop this?
I'm not shocked. Many of my colleagues are mathematicians, and they're not necessarily the people who like to talk to the media. So that's one of the problems that we have. So I shouldn't just blame other people. I think I should blame my own profession too. But other than that, politicians should listen to scientists who actually know something about the subject matter that is involved in their decision making. But what I don't understand is why politicians, starting with our president and the New York mayor, until a particular day, what they say makes perfect sense. The president said, this is a flu. The mayor of New York said, closing schools doesn't make any sense. And then it took them the next day, well, different days, but the next day after they said one thing, they made a 180-degree turn and said, okay, let's shut down the whole economy and let's shut down schools in New York. So why do politicians who have been saying the right thing for quite some time, from one day to the next, suddenly change their mind? I have no clue.
You know, I thought at the time Donald Trump was saying this looks like a flu. It looked like a flu to us also, and my team of scientists and mathematicians that I'm working with. But I have to imagine when the head of your health department, or Dr. Tony Fauci, who has been the head of NIAID for, multiple decades, says to you, Mr. President, you're wrong on this. People are going to die. When we're looking at the numbers, we're looking at the potential that millions could die. How does a politician override that type of statement? I mean, that would take, either a personal education we didn't know about or, a really strong sense of opinion, wouldn't it?
I think the only way to protect against is to listen to more than just one or two people. So listen to people who represent different fields and try to aggregate the information that you get and also to question them. It's not about, okay, this is the guy I believe and this is my guru and then I do whatever that person says. It should be about, okay, let's convene a couple of experts from different fields and have a discussion. And I'm not sure that this happened. I haven't heard about this happening.
So am I to understand your concern is that you don't think mathematicians were involved in this process?
I'm not aware of any. Everything I hear, all the people I hear talking are either virologists or MDs. Now, a virologist can tell you exactly how the surface of a virus looks like and many of the other things. I don't want to simplify what they're doing. An MD is trained in making a diagnosis for a particular patient and find the right treatment for that patient. So these are, of course, this is very much an oversimplification, but these are the key issues that these professions handle. Well, we as epidemiologists are dealt with we learn how to do mathematical models, how to fit them against data, how to make sure that they're the appropriate models, and how to understand the complexity of the non-linear dynamics of that epidemics.
So when we look at numbers, I think that people would argue, you are arguing we should have just let this run its course. And I'll tell you that even on this show, which I know you haven't watched the episodes we've done, it does appear there is a small group of people that are having a very dramatic effect with this illness. And the concern was overrunning New York hospitals. I'm not in New York. I can't get inside the hospital. It looks like they're on the verge of capacity. Wasn't there a real risk that we could overrun that capacity had we just let it run its course, even if it was a small percentage? If that percentage was so acute as it appears to be, would that have been a really dramatic problem? And that's why we decided to lock it down. Go ahead.
It wasn't a real risk. Now, I would like to make one comment and correct something that I don't want to be misinterpreted. I don't say we shouldn't do anything. There's something that's very important to do, and that is to isolate or separate those who are vulnerable, who are old, who have comorbidities. They should stay away from people who could potentially be infected. So they should stay at home. But this is nothing new. in every flu season, we tell the elderly, don't use the subway, don't go by bus, don't stay at home and separate yourself, reduce the exposure to the virus because you are highly vulnerable. So that is something that definitely should take place, and we should do that. The government should pay for pharmacies to deliver all pharmacies. They should pay for food being delivered, for all the services that people are asking for to be able to separate themselves for a short period of time, and that is about 3 or 4 weeks from the epidemic. That makes perfect sense, and I'm fully supportive of that. However, shutting down schools and shutting down business has nothing to do with it, and it's actually increasing the load for the hospitals. Because if you tell elderly and people with comorbidities to separate, the epidemic is running among the children and the young adults, and they don't need to be hospitalized. They don't need it. They have a minor, either they don't realize anything, or it's a minor thing that happens. Okay, one day your nose is running, or you have a bit of a feeling a bit uncomfortable. But that's about it. The hospitals are overrun by the elderly people, mostly. So if you separate them, you're protecting the hospitals from becoming overloaded. On the other hand, if you prevent the virus from spreading among the youth, the virus stays there longer and is spreading among the elderly and those who have comorbidities. And in the end, you have more people who are dying than you would otherwise have. And I don't think that's a good public health policy.
We're seeing reports of people being arrested for being out on their surfboard out in the water, or people taking a stroll on a beach outside. They've closed down national parks, outdoor places. What do you think about the approach of keeping people from going outside and keeping them locked in their houses as an approach to stopping this illness?
Okay. The reason that we don't see flu epidemics during the summer is that people spend more time outdoors, or at least that's one of the very big factors. So it is not, respiratory diseases are not being spread outdoors. They're being spread indoors.
It's being reported that I think the Prime Minister of Australia is saying that they plan or intend on maintaining some form of social distancing and locking down until the vaccine is available. What do you have to say about waiting for this vaccine and staying with this approach until then?
I don't understand the whole thing. The first thing is, it's going to take about a year, maybe longer. Everything else is wishful thinking. It's going to take time. So we have to, whatever is being developed has to be tested, first for safety, then for efficacy, and then eventually it can be brought to the public, and that whole process takes time. And why you can, I don't see this, and I don't understand how people could even fathom this, that the society is being shut down for a whole year, let's say. Humans are social beings, and to have mental health, they need to interact with other people. And we have now seen that the last month, more guns were bought in the United States than ever before in any month, as long as people are counting guns. Now, just imagine, these guns are now in the hands of people who become less and less stable, more and more depressed, have less and less the possibility to align their thoughts with the thoughts of other people. All of the things that we humans do. What will happen? Eventually somebody will shoot somebody else because he's not wearing a mask. And I'm not joking. I really think that we have already had, yesterday or the day before yesterday, was somebody shot his partner and then himself because his partner was infected with coronavirus. And things like, if we push the whole society into the realm of insanity, I don't think that will be beneficial to the society.
Just because it's the big question going all over the internet, when there is a coronavirus vaccine, will you take a coronavirus vaccine, and why?
I usually take vaccine shots, and I will take that vaccine shot too if it has been tested and shown to be both safe and effective. I would take it like every other flu virus. So in a year or 2 years from now, if people have evidence that the coronavirus is about to spread again, then that should be incorporated into the annual flu vaccine and be used. I don't see any problem with that. I'm taking the other vaccines. I would take that as well.
In a world where most media and virtually every political leader in the world has agreed with the principle of using social distancing and locking down, we still hear around the world that that will be the approach going into the fall should this illness come back. It seems to me that someone of your stature and background is really putting your career on the line to step forward and make these statements that you're making right now. Can you tell me what has inspired you to write the paper that you're writing, to come on shows like this and try and tell people that you think this approach of locking down the healthy? Now, I think you made a really good point. Let's protect the elderly and the immune suppressed. I agree with that. But why are you taking this risk with your career?
I think we, as human beings and as members of society, we have a responsibility. We have the responsibility to do best what we are being trained to do, and that's what I'm doing.
Well, I want to thank you for doing it, Knut. It's really nice to be able to believe in scientists that follow the science, and you don't seem to have an agenda with this. At least when we looked into you, I don't know what you would have to gain. But it's refreshing to hear your perspective. And the truth is you're not alone. There are many, many scientists and mathematicians speaking out around the world on this topic. What would be, if you had, a moment to sit down with Donald Trump right now, what would you want to say to Donald Trump?
I would say we need to reopen schools immediately. That's the most important thing to do. And then we have to reopen businesses to keep the economy going. The initial assessment, this is a flu, is right, or was right. And because it was right, it still is right, and we should treat it as any other flu.
Wow, I mean, that's a powerful statement and testimony by a world-renowned mathematician that has been graphing and modeling his entire life. If you've been watching the High Wire over the last several weeks, you know that there are so many scientists now stepping forward and jumping on the other side of this conversation and saying, we've got it dead wrong. We've had it dead wrong from the beginning. The things that Knut's saying are so powerful. When I think about what he's describing as he said a lockdown is only preventing herd immunity from building up in many ways. And the conversation that I think we all really need to start having, and by the way, you can see how dangerous this show is right now. I mean, I don't know if this is going to stay on Facebook and YouTube. So please remember, if you like the information you're getting and you want to keep hearing from world-renowned scientists, then if you're on YouTube right now, will you go ahead and subscribe? That'll help us promote through YouTube while we exist there. But then take one additional measure after you've subscribed on YouTube or wherever you're watching. Go ahead then and go to our website, thehighwire.com/watch, and sign up to our email list so you'll always be able to find us and this information because it's critical. Now let's get into, I want to get into the details of what Knut was covering in his paper. You heard a lot about his opinion. I didn't have him in studio, so he couldn't go over the graphs. But when you look at the paper that he put out challenging this idea, this is it, the first 3 months of the COVID-19 epidemic, epidemiological evidence for 2 separate strains of SARS-CoV-2 viruses spreading, and implications for prevention strategies by Knut M. Witkowski. This was his paper, and in it some really, and you, again, We will get you those details. If you're a recurring donor, it's going to be in your newsletter. If you type in ICAN right now on Facebook or you text us at 33222, we'll try to get you all this information so you can read the paper yourself. But here is the conversation now we are facing here in America and around the world. When does this lockdown end? How do we avoid more lockdowns in the future? And the biggest mama of all questions, was this lockdown necessary and was it effective? Did it work? And one of the things when Newt has been discussing this very issue, we are seeing China now going back to work. They are going back to work, and Knut is saying in his paper the reason is because they have herd immunity. Not the story we were being told by Deborah Birx and by Tony Fauci that it's because they simply, killed the virus by starving it out and disappearing. He's saying no, because they all got it, that they ended up quarantining too late. Let me explain this by going through the graphs that Knut showed us in the paper, and then I have some groundbreaking ways to look at our new numbers. You are not going to see this anywhere else. Let's take a look up on the board over here, okay? So in the study, in this paper that Knut Witkowski put out, what he said is China did not avoid herd immunity. They didn't stop it. In fact, they have herd immunity, and this is why, he says, if you look at the graph, these are the China numbers graphed out, right? Cases in mainland China, okay? And what he points out in this paper is that you didn't lock down right as this thing was coming up so you could have stopped it from happening. In fact, what we realize is that in the beginning, we look at February 5th, okay? Right here is really that gradual point. Remember, don't look at this point. What did Knut tell us? That evolution tells us that there's no such thing as a jump, that everything happens smooth with nature. It goes up and then it comes down. Really, really an interesting thought when we think about the nature of all viruses and how they work. So obviously there was some sort of filing thing that must have happened here that popped up on this date. But what we really see here was that this was the peak right around February 5th in China. This was the peak of their epidemic, right? Well, when did they actually begin their lockdown? If you look in the newspapers, you will find out that it wasn't until over here on the 17th of February. This is when the newspapers report that they're shutting down all of the schools. Not here at the peak, but all the way over here. So the virus, as many, many scientists now around the world are saying, it was already in full scale. It was already sweeping through the population, and in fact was even going down at the point with which you finally decided to lock China down. This is why we are assuming now China must know this. They must be saying, we have no problem. In fact, we now know so many people are infected, we probably have herd immunity. We're going back online. That's a serious issue. China is now back onto the racetrack, as I talked about last week. One of the greatest producers and economic empires the world has ever seen is back on the track while we are all still hiding in our houses doing what we believe to be correct. Now, I think that's a really incredible point. He says the same thing about South Korea, but he goes on to say, we're seeing cases in South Korea because they might have quarantined not in time to stop a large infection, but enough to dwarf the power of your herd immunity so that the virus was still hanging around. Now, is it possible this is what was happening in America? Can we say these numbers are so low or the death rate is so low because social distancing or quarantine worked? Here's something I want to point out to you that is also discussed in Knut's paper, that we are now backdating what we know to be true about when people were infected. Remember, we are hearing in science all around the world that they believe that there's a 14-day incubation period, the moment where you're asymptomatic and don't know you have it until we start seeing your symptoms arrive, okay? So when that's graphed out, let's look at China with that graphed out because it shows us something very important. Okay, This, what you're looking at now, is the date of reporting in China. We just showed you, but we're graphing it out in a different way here, right? This is the date that was reported. But what we recognize is this is when people were symptomatic. This is when we knew that they had the illness. But now we're recognizing that this is really just an echo of what took place. This is when the infection actually took place, which makes it even more clear as we go back that it was back in January that this thing had already spiked in China and hit the top of its line and was plateauing itself, not in February. So if you didn't lock down all the way until February 17th, obviously this thing was everywhere. We knew what it was doing. And this is what is really important, we believe, to start thinking about. And I think you're going to hear a lot more scientists talking about this. We are looking at the echo of what has already taken place. This is dangerous. All of our numbers and our thinking about this have been based in the echo, which means long after you were already infected. Now, we're not the only ones looking at this. In fact, if you go to the CDC's own website, remember, we were told that the 21st of January was the first case in America. But look what they're doing now. If you look, it says January 21st, but they're saying, you know, the impact moment or the moment of contact where you got the illness, look where they're listing it. They're now placing the first cases on the 14th. So the CDC is now backdating and showing this echo. They're saying, yes, this is what we knew, but you've got to go back 7 days. Now, that's a very conservative number, 7 days, especially when most of the scientific community is looking at perhaps a 14-day period where you're asymptomatic and don't know that you're now infected. But here's why this is important, and I need you to pay attention here, because this is modeling that I think you're going to start seeing more thoughts like this that are going to tell us a very different story. Since the CDC is backdating at the moment of, onset, not of actual infection, then we have got to say that all of these graphs have got to shift by 7 days. Why is that important? Let us show you the numbers at the CDC if we backdate it the 7 days. We take what they're saying and we go by the daily report. This is what this looks like. Okay, this is now starting, as you now see, earlier, and then we are coming across, right? We have moved everything back. We see the dates of impact. Now, what this does is, what this shows you is, if we're looking at a 1-week incubation period, this was going up. We had all of these people that were being infected and having an onset. Well, right here, this right here is where we started talking about social distancing, meaning we're going to walk amongst each other, keep our 6-foot distance. That started taking place on the on the 16th of March, okay? This is when we did this. Well, look it. We were already at our peak. We were already right there. Remember, what we were looking at was over here, but we've now looked at the incident, not the shadow, not the echo over here. If we look at the real moment of impact, it looks clear that we had already, and these are all the real numbers. Look, it doesn't keep going up. Once we start social distancing, we've flattened out. And you know what this red line here is? This red line is when we started our lockdown, after we've already plateaued in the numbers. You see, these viruses work just like Knut said. It goes up. He said if we just left it alone, this thing would have just taken another couple of weeks, and then it would have gone away. And we would have this great bonus of herd immunity. But instead, we started messing with it once we'd already peaked, once it was already deep into our population. And then we used this other issue of locking people down. Now, let me be clear. When you're looking at this now, this green arrow is where we believe these numbers could change. Beyond here, these may go up because, remember, we're backdating 7 days. Much of this information is still coming in. Again, I have no agenda. I'm not trying to, do anything except show you what we are learning from these numbers. Now let's take a look at something different. This is 7 days. This is what the CDC is doing, is they're backdating 7 days. But what if we went by what most scientists around the world are saying? It's a 14-day incubation period. And then you can do models based on 12 days and 10 days and everything else. But let's look at the difference in the 14-day incubation period. This is what happens to your graph. At 2 weeks, we realize if we backdate and imagine that this is the moment of onset and the echo was over here, look what happens. This shows us that this is how many people, and by the way, you're seeing these articles come out of California right now. We're wondering if we got the dates right, if maybe people were infected earlier. Is that why we're seeing lower numbers? See, we had already plateaued. This thing was working itself out. And again, even more dramatically, if it is a 14-day incubation period, this is when we started social distancing, long after we'd plateaued, still plateauing. And now, based on this graph, we might be going down before we even started the lockdown, because what we were seeing in New York is right here. And this explains in many ways why all of these models may be off. Why just last week they said it's going to go on the incline. We're going into the dramatic effect. No, because you were looking at the wrong part of this. You were looking at the echo numbers of the infection numbers, not of the dates of onset. You see, good science does this a totally different way, and we're starting to move in that direction. Let me remind you, we don't know that it dropped before we got to the moment where we started to lock ourselves down, because after this green line, this data could still be coming in. We're still collecting this data. So these numbers may go up. They may get flat. We don't know. But what I'm trying to show you is, even though Cuomo and everyone around the world is saying, oh my God, we're going to run out of ventilators, the models are showing us it's going to keep going like this. It never did. It never did. And this might be explaining to us why. Now remember, Italy still saw its numbers going up after they locked down. We did not. Maybe we got in a little earlier. But here's the question. The question is, did we, in fact, hurt ourselves? Would we have stayed plateaued here, able to handle all of the people in the hospital? And by the way, right now, we might just be finally treating these people the right way and putting them on oxygen instead of ventilators and actually saving them instead of killing them. And if that was the case, then all that would really be happening, as Knut pointed out, is we would be having school children immune, people that are working having herd immunity. And when we think about herd immunity, if China has herd immunity now because they already got this thing, and all we did was keep us from getting to that herd immunity point, so that if Donald Trump opens it back up, we're all going to get infected again because it's still floating around, because all we did was destroy the possibility of herd immunity. Do you see the implications on a world scale that this is going to have? Do you see how bad it will be to have China ahead of us, back out and working and perfectly healthy, when we have to ask, are we going to just keep quarantining ourselves on and off? Remember what Knut said. The only reason we're going to have a second surge is if we did the wrong thing and stopped ourselves from getting to herd immunity. It almost sounds like that was the plan, to not have herd immunity. Interesting. I think I heard Dr. Fauci say exactly that.
We go through multiple cycles of influenza. There's always a degree of background immunity in the population. I mean, that will ultimately happen if we get a situation where we get back to normal. Now, I hope we don't have so many people infected that we actually have that herd immunity, but I think it would have to be different than it is right now.
I hope we don't get to that herd immunity. Are you kidding me? Is that actually a goal of the medical professionals right now? And why would that be the goal? What else is there other than herd immunity? Is lockdown? Is quarantine? That's the only other choice we have. So you saying you don't want herd immunity, Dr. Fauci? That you don't want to follow in China's footsteps? We want to stay locked down? No, instead of hearing about getting out there, getting schools back online, doing what Sweden did, do what Austria is now showing that worked out, in Denmark, that are all getting back online, in China. No, we have this other approach, and you're trying to tell us it's the right way. But here's the problem. You're acting like there's a savior out there, like there's something supposed to work, that's something instead of herd immunity. Why would we want to block herd immunity? Is it possible that we want a vaccine? Is that what this is all about? I mean, this is a conversation that I'm seeing happen. Just take a look at what they're telling us we're supposed to be waiting for. Listen to this very quickly.
When will a corona vaccine be ready? A vaccine that enables us to resume our lives without restrictions while protecting us from the disease.
The only thing that will really allow life as we once knew it to resume is a vaccine.
We should be and are and will be making a universal corona vaccine. To me, That's the best long-term goal for this.
This is a whole new era for making vaccines, and one that's emphasizing speed.
What we need is to make vaccines for 1 billion people, and we need to make that as quickly as possible.
Vaccines won't be ready overnight. They will take months.
Probably 14, 15, 16 months.
At least 12 to 18 months away.
Until we have a vaccine.
Until we get a vaccine.
There's a new hope for a vaccine.
That's how long strict rules will be in place across the state.
It is fair to say things won't go back to truly normal until we have a vaccine that we've gotten out to basically the entire world.
Things won't go back to normal until we have a vaccine for the entire world. Sounds like they're back to normal in China. Sounds like they're going back to normal in Denmark and Austria, hold on, and probably in Sweden also. So only for us, for those places like Australia, where I'm hearing that the Prime Minister might lock down all of Australia until there's a vaccine available, this coronavirus social distancing to stay until vaccine is found. Are you ready for that, folks? Is that what we're waiting for? See, here's what's starting to bother me, and it was really exemplified. I had a friend of mine text me, and he's a chiropractor by trade, and he said, my own mother-in-law, look what she texted, and she basically said that, you know, my husband and I are going to get the COVID-19 vaccine, and if you don't get the COVID-19 vaccine, you're not allowed in our house. You see, the problem I have with that, and what I said to my friend is, she might as well been writing, we are going to get a unicorn for COVID-19, and if you don't believe in unicorns, then you're not allowed in our house. See, I don't care how dreamy it is or special it is that you have an idea for a vaccine. Here's the point. There is no vaccine in existence, right? It does not exist. You can attack chloroquine and drugs that do exist, which makes no sense, but our salvation is in something that doesn't exist? I mean, think about that. The mythological beauty of this thing, this chance and hope that sits out there in the future is really a vaccine unicorn. That's what we're waiting for. Folks, this is not how science is done. Science is not based on wishful thinking. It's not based on dreams and hopes. It's based on things that are tangible and facts. And though I have nothing against, by the way, someone trying to create a vaccine or some way to protect people who may need it, that tiny percentage of people that are having a very acute and serious reaction to this illness, I do want to see it safe. I do want it to take its time to go through studies. But guess what? Before it even becomes a policy in this government, and certainly being spoken about by the heads of our health department that are setting policy of whether I get in and out of my home, it better actually exist. Right? Are we locked down for a mythological figure? We are. In fact, this is not only something that doesn't exist, it happens to be one of the most difficult vaccines ever attempted. That is exemplified by the very scientists that have been attempting to make this thing over the last several years. Here's some of their own sound bites.
The issue of safety, something that I want to make sure the American public understand. It's not only safety when you inject somebody and they get maybe an idiosyncratic reaction, they get a little allergic reaction, they get pain. There's safety associated. Does the vaccine make you worse? And there are diseases in which you vaccinate someone, they get infected with what you're trying to protect them with, and you actually enhance the infection. So the worst possible thing you could do is vaccinate somebody to prevent infection and actually make them worse.
Dr. Fauci says he thinks this could be done as early as 12 to 18 months. That's really optimistic. Do extensive testing of this vaccine before you put it out there into millions of people, because I think there now is this kind of break the glass mentality of full speed ahead, cut the corners you need to cut. And I really, really, really hope we don't do that, because especially for a vaccine that you may be giving to tens of millions of people or more.
Vaccines have to be tested because there's precedent for vaccines to actually make diseases worse. And you really don't want to make it, you don't want to rush and treat 1 million people and find out you're making 900,000 of them worse.
One of the things that we're not hearing a lot about is the unique
potential safety problem of coronavirus vaccines. This was first found in the early 1960s with respiratory syncytial virus vaccines. Some of those kids who got the vaccine actually did worse, and I believe there were 2 deaths in the consequence of that study, because what happens with certain types of respiratory virus vaccines, you get immunized, and then when you get actually exposed to the virus, you get this kind of paradoxical immune enhancement phenomenon. And we don't entirely understand the basis of it, but we recognize that it's a real problem for certain respiratory virus vaccines. That killed the RSV program for decades. Now the Gates Foundation is taking it up again. But when we started developing coronavirus vaccines and our colleagues, we noticed in laboratory animals that they started to show some of the same immune pathology that resembled what had happened 50 years earlier. So we said, oh my God, this is going to be problematic.
It's very, very problematic, and we covered all of the details of these animal studies that Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Fauci are referencing in a show many weeks back. So if you want to get the truth on that, again, all you had to be doing is watching the High Wire. I hope you watched really the last 5 or 6 episodes around coronavirus, because you'll see that in the animal trials, the animals got more sick, many died, cytokine storms, a horrible reaction to the actual virus after it looked like the vaccine was perfectly safe. This is a serious problem. There's also another problem. Not only have most of scientists bailed out on making a coronavirus vaccine that we're now all waiting for, the vaccine unicorn, to show up, this is also the first ever mRNA vaccine using our RNA. This has been attempted now since the early 1990s. They have been trying to make a vaccine that uses a totally different approach. It doesn't just submit and trying to get antibodies. It tries to go into your cells. It tries to go in there and trick your cells into believing it's getting a messaging from the DNA through what's called the messaging RNA, that the DNA is telling it, create these proteins to protect yourself. Folks, they are spelunking into a place in the immune system they have never gone before, and they failed at it since the 1990s. So this is a very, very difficult situation. Almost as bad as that storm you can probably hear outside of the studio right now that's thundering and raining. So let me make this final point. Though it is perfectly noble, I guess, to sit at home and dream about unicorns and things that might save us in the future, I read a story just like that to my 6-year-old daughter last night. But that is not how science is done. That is not how you run world economies. It is certainly not how you handle the United States of America. We cannot wait for a unicorn. And what happens if the unicorn finally arrives and it looks more like this? Would you like to have the ability to opt out if that's what they present to you? I mean, this is the truth, folks. Science is real. Math are facts. Numbers are able to be graphed. Let's get to the real numbers. Do not let public officials now and some idea that we're all in this together and that all science agrees that we should have locked down and that all science is showing you that that is the answer. In fact, I think we are learning a much different lesson here. And I think we should listen to Knut Wittkowski when we think about how we're going to move forward. At some point, those of us that are healthy are going to have to get this illness. That is the only way to herd immunity until that ugly or pretty unicorn arrives. And frankly, I'm not going to sit in my house and wait for it. So what do? I suggest we take the trillions of dollars in severance packages to the United States of America and cut out a few $1 billion. And let's go and make sure that every senior center in the country has the ability to lock itself down the next time we have a viral outbreak like this, so that those people can be protected. And let's have a severance package that pays those doctors and nurses a little bit more money, since they're going to be locked in with their patients until the 3 or 4 weeks are up, where the rest of us experience a common cold and have achieved herd immunity. Now, you may not like that idea. Maybe you want to wait for a unicorn, and this is the United States of America. But wouldn't an intelligent society be working on multiple fronts towards an outcome that could save us? Not just one, the only one that doesn't exist as we know it? Sounds like someone else is seconding my point. I hope we're still live. But let me say this. There is a better way forward. It's called herd immunity. We're watching it happen all around the world. This is just a flu based on the numbers and most of the scientists and mathematicians that are talking about this. Just because 2 of the virologists and MDs that are speaking to America are telling us not to listen to it, maybe saying that that is false information or maybe that it's a conspiracy. Conspiracies are not run by top mathematicians and scientists. They are not the health department of Italy that said to us, 88% of our cases did not die from COVID. They died to their comorbidities. Folks, we need herd immunity. We need to get it now. That may mean locking down those that are sick right now. By the way, if respirators was our hope, we now know that that may have been the wrong approach altogether, and that was the only thing we were worried about actually running out of. We've always had plenty of beds, and we definitely have great doctors. Let's let them get back to work. Let's let all of us get back to work. Let's move towards sanity, using math and science as a benefit. And more of that is going to be coming by the boatloads, like the rain outside. I'll see you next week on the High Wire.
Thanks for watching, and thank you for being a High Wire insider. Be sure to share this show with your friends on Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, and Instagram, because knowledge is power, power is freedom, and we need all we can get. Did you notice that this show doesn't have any commercials? I'm not selling you diapers or vitamins or smoothies or gasoline. That's because I don't want corporate sponsors telling us what to investigate and what to say. Instead, you're our sponsors. This is a production by our nonprofit, the Informed Consent Action Network. If you want more investigations, more hard-hitting news, if you want the truth, go to ICanDecide.org and donate now.